Hi fellow book lovers and welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new here. It's nice to have you. I thought today we would talk about rating systems because I am pedantic when it comes to how I rate books. So my drink of choice today is just a simple oat milk latte from Cafe Nero. Grab your drink and let's get started. So I used to very much rate books by gut feeling. If it felt like a 5-star book, that's what I would give it. Similarly, if it felt like a 2-star, I would go with 2 stars. But then I'd get to the end of the year and look back on my reading history and think, how could those two books possibly share the same rating? Because they felt so different to me, which made me question everything. So I came up with a points-based system where I would look at criteria like plot, character, prose, how original the plot felt, also dialogue, and I'd score those out of 5, come up with my average, and then pretty much have my rating based on that, which felt a little bit more sensical to me because I just felt like there was rhyme and there was reason. But then I still got to a point, even for ratings I've given so far this year, I look at them and go, I'm not sure that that's what I should have rated them. But then I looked at just kind of rating things by how they make me feel when I'm reading. And I've been doing that for a month and kind of felt like it's the most accurate ratings I've given so far. Today I wanted to run through how I'm rating these books and also give you an example of a book that falls into that rating. So starting with 1 star, and this is very rare for me because I am a generous reviewer. 1 star for me would mean I DNF'd it. It was either very poorly written or just a poor story, or something about it just did not at all resonate with me. Now, an example of this, because there are so few of these, is Survivor by Chuck Palahniuk. I am a huge Fight Club fan. I loved both the movie and the book. And so I was really keen to kind of dive into Chuck Palahniuk's bibliography. And even though I really liked the idea of it because it follows this guy who's pretty much joined a death cult and he's on this flight that's about to crash, I felt like this character was so unsettling, not in like a good way. It's not something that kind of drew me in. It like very much like repulsed me how he went about life, and it was just like the littlest things that he did that really made me feel so uneasy. And there was one scene in particular, if you have read this book, you'll probably know what I mean when I say the lobster scene. I DNF'd it, I think, at about 20-30 pages in. A 2-star would be something like Blood Orange by Karina Hill. I DNF this too, but I could see why people would enjoy it. This one is a spicy read, and I was really disappointed by this because I love vampire books and I've been really wanting to get back into vampire literature of any kind. This one felt really clumsy to me. I think I got 20% in and I just wasn't feeling the plot. I didn't like the characters. I didn't think they had any personality or any chemistry from what I'd seen in that 20%. I also felt like the prose was just kind of cringy. I just knew that it wasn't a book for me. But the other people in that reading group did go on to read it and enjoy it, and I could see why they would. I just knew that it wasn't a book for me, and so that would be a 2-star for me. Now, moving on to a 2.5, for me, that would mean there were so many things that I did not enjoy, but I did finish it. So something like Broken Bonds by J. Bree would fall into a 2.5 for me. I thought this book had a very questionable spicy scene. Also felt really clumsy in prose. There wasn't much plot. For something that is a Y2 fantasy romance, it felt almost juvenile in how it was written. Like, it didn't feel grown up. It didn't feel like it was progressing into something. It just felt like it was kind of stumbling through the book, and maybe there wasn't a strong enough plot to sort of carry this book. 2.75 would similarly be something that had something that was engaging, but you couldn't get fully on board with that book. So the second book in the Broken Bonds series, so also by J. Bree, Savage Bonds, was a 2.75 for me. It felt like there was a little bit more happening. Maybe this is because I listened to it on audiobook, but I did feel like the prose was a little bit stronger than it was in the first book. I also felt like it was finally leaning into the fact that it was a wide choose. So there was a little bit more happening in that department. You might be asking, if you didn't enjoy Broken Bonds, why did you read Savage Bonds? And you'd be absolutely right in asking that, because I don't even know. I feel like there's something about this series that really like draws you in, but it isn't good. I think a 2.75 for me is quite similar to a 2.5. It's maybe just like a tiny bit more enjoyable. Next is a 3-star. Now, something like Scythe by Neil Shusterman would be a 3-star for me. And this is basically marginally better than, say, a 2.75 and a 2.5, but nowhere near a masterpiece. This book had so much potential for me. I love the idea of this AI evolution where, you know, it's created this perfect utopia where pretty much like you do not get ill, you do not really suffer in any way. Of course, that means what do we do with overpopulation? These scythes basically go in and they need to cull the population, and they all sort of have their own ways of doing this. For me, this again felt quite juvenile for something that is quite a grown-up theme and quite an intense book. The characters weren't enjoyable. The male main character was slightly better, and I liked where they were heading with his arc towards the end of this book, but I don't think I was compelled enough by what this gave me to go on and read the rest of the series. Now, a 3.5 for me would be something that is objectively good, but just wasn't for me. Stone Blind by Natalie Haynes is a great example of this. I was so disappointed by this book because I love Medusa, I love underdogs in Greek myth, and I was really excited for her story to be done some justice, and I just felt like this was kind of all over the place. I think for a Medusa story, it didn't have enough of Medusa. I understand the concept of this, but I wanted her to be front and center, and she just wasn't. I also felt like the prose wasn't quite taking the story serious enough, especially because Medusa was done so dirty. I felt like the text was almost like making fun of the story. I don't think that was Natalie Haynes' intention, but I just felt like that's how it came across. Another example would be something like Electra by Jennifer Saint. Greek myth is really heavy and like full of tragedy. Usually if you have one POV, you're getting some relief between something really awful and traumatic happening because it's one person telling like their entire story. So it's not going to be doom and gloom all the way through. However, with this, because it's 3 POVs and we're alternating between them, so we're almost getting the worst of each person, it just felt incredibly heavy. I also didn't love the way Clytemnestra was portrayed in this. Similarly, Electra, I felt like she was really bratty. And I think I just didn't quite like maybe the way that the characters were portrayed. It just wasn't my favorite Greek retelling. Next is a 3.75, which for me again is a good book, but there was just something missing and something that didn't quite hook me. An example of this would be All of Us Villains by Amanda Foody and Christine Lynn Herman. I read this quite recently and I did speed through this because I love the idea of this book. Those of you who don't know, it's basically Hunger Games with villains. You have these 7 cursed families who have to compete in these games every 20 years, and they basically need to kill each other off until there's one champion. I think it had so much potential, and I wanted it to be really dark. I wanted these characters to be incredibly morally not even morally grey, morally black. I wanted them to be the worst people. And I think I was just let down by the fact that these kids were sort of moral. Like whenever they did anything, apart from maybe the last 50 pages, whenever they did something, it was with good reason. I just wanted it to be a bit darker. Another example of a 3.75 for me would be something like The Whispering Dark by Kelly Andrew. This had so much potential, and there were parts of this I really loved. This is basically a story told in three parts. The first part is really confusing, and I actually quite enjoyed the first part because you weren't quite sure if she was living it or she was imagining it or dreaming. The first part sets up quite a few questions. In the second part, we start to get answers. And then the third part kind of just speeds through, you know, resolutions and to kind of tie everything up. And I think the pacing of this was just really off. I think if the pacing had been better, this would have been a really good book. Our main character, Delaney, is deaf. She lost her hearing when she had a near death experience. This does have a dark academia feel. I really like the paranormal elements of this. These, I think, are good examples of books that I enjoyed, but I knew something about it wasn't quite right. Now, a 4-star for me would be a good book, something I genuinely enjoyed reading. Something like God Killer by Hannah Kaner, which I read quite recently. If you haven't read this one and you are a fan of sort of quest fantasy, I would really recommend this. This follows 3 characters. We have Kissin, Elo, and Inna, and they're all sort of on their separate quests, but then they end up going to Midran, and they become unlikely travel companions. They sort of form this really cool dynamic. So there is like a bit of a family element in this too. I enjoyed it, but I would have liked more God killing because it is literally the title. Similarly, something like Mina and Undead. I really enjoyed reading this book. I had Buddy read this as well with someone, and it was just a joy actually comparing notes. It is super nostalgic. It is set in the 90s. In this, we follow Mina, who goes to stay with her sister in New Orleans. Her sister gets her a job at this sort of haunted mansion where she works. Mina does not make it a day before there's trouble. I really liked that this was spooky and it had that sort of like 90s, early 2000s slasher film feel to it, which I really enjoyed. There were so many things I did like, even though with this that I felt like the pacing was just like a tiny bit off. And I think things happened really conveniently as well. But I did really enjoy this. So yeah, these are good examples of good books for me. 4.25 would be a really solid read. Something like Witherwood by Hannah Matthewson. Now, I was first drawn to this book because it reminded me of something like A Darker Shade of Magic by V. Schwab, where we have an alternate London. Now, in this case, the alternate London is sort of the magic London. There are different factions of magic, and they all live in this magic London. Also, our main character comes from non-magic London. It does have a sort of murder mystery type Sherlocky vibe to it, where there's this mystery to be uncovered, and while Ilsa is trying to do that, she's also kind of learning about herself and what she can do, and like learning about this magic. It felt really whimsical. It felt really fun. I loved Ilsa as a character. So yeah, this is a really solid read for me. 4.5 would be something that I had a wonderful time reading. One I've just finished that falls into this category is 16 Souls by Rosie Talbot. This one follows Charlie, who had a near-death experience and woke up with the ability to see ghosts. He lives in York, which is pretty much the UK's like infamously haunted city. So there are a lot of ghosts around. When the ghosts start to go missing, Charlie doesn't exactly feel the need to rush out and figure out what's going on, but he kind of teams up with Sam, who shows up later, and they set about figuring out what is going on. So there is again a bit of like a murder mystery element to it. The dynamic between Sam and Charlie was amazing. His disability rep in this, trans rep, I really enjoyed this book. I think it was so beautifully written. It just kind of really suited the kind of gothic, almost like Victorian vibe that I got from York when I went to visit. Similarly, in the 4.5, which is having a ball of a time reading it, is Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. This book felt so wholesome to me, and you might not think it when you consider it is sort of a space thriller because we have our main character who wakes up in space alone. And not only is he alone, but he has no recollection of how he got there. There is a very unlikely friendship in this book that is honestly one of the most wholesome things I've ever read. I had a great time reading this book. A 4.75 for me would be a near perfect book. And this has become my most common rating because I used to rate quite generously and give a lot of books a 5 star. And then last year I read something which I'll get to in a moment that blew me away. And now I'm a little bit more reluctant to give good books 5 stars because I feel like if it's not giving me that feeling, I can't give it a 5 star. It doesn't make sense to me. So a lot of books recently have fallen into the 4.75 rating for me. An example of this would be One for My Enemy by Olivia Blake. There's so many things I liked about this book. The form of it's really cool because it is a Romeo and Juliet retelling of sorts and has that kind of Shakespearean feel to it, and also really cleverly it's written like a play. So we have acts and we have scenes. We have witches in modern day New York, and we have this rivalry between the two families as per Romeo and Juliet, where there's almost like a drug war between the two, and I really like that aspect of it. I also liked a small detail, but the fact that the one family as a front had like a magical cosmetic shop of sorts, so like a Lush. If you're in the UK, you'd know what I'm talking about. Another one that would fall into the category is Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. Again, there is an alternate London. I just really like alternate Londons apparently. But we have Richard May, who's perfectly happy with his life. He has a good job, he has a fiance, but something's not quite right. And then Richard encounters Dor, who is a girl from London Below, and their lives kind of become linked. And he goes to London Below, and we have these magical markets, we have creatures that we wouldn't have in everyday London. And there was a real like whimsical fantasy feel to this. But I also really, really like Richard's progression in the book. He goes from someone who's quite timid to someone who really knows what he wants by the end of the book and is quite like content with who he has become. Now that brings us to 5 stars. 5 star now for me would mean something that I love with my entire being. The perfect example of this is The 10,000 Doors of January by Alexei Harrow. I had read this and I was so blown away by it. I, for the first time, understood what people meant by a comfort read because this is very much what I envision my comfort read to be. I love this book with every fiber of my being. And so I compare everything to this, and if it does not give me the same feeling I had reading this, it cannot be a 5 star for me. So this one, if you don't know, follows January, who had been orphaned, and she lives with a wealthy beneficiary, Mr. Locke, who goes around collecting artifacts. I loved the magic system because it is a portal fantasy, which I really enjoy, but it was quite simple, if that makes sense. But everything about this book felt cozy. The prose in this is absolutely beautiful, and I think Alexei Harrow does like really clever things with prose here as well. This is a really beautiful book, and I urge you, if you enjoy things that feel cozy, definitely give this a go. Another book that falls into the 5 star category for me, which is quite a recent book and kicked off my obsession with Neil Gaiman, is The Ocean at the End of the Lane. I very strangely, I think, find this cozy even though it is quite creepy. We basically have the boy, and a sequence of events leads this boy to the Hempstock farm, which is the farm at the end of the lane, and he basically goes on this insane little journey. It feels like a children's story, but there's such growth in this, and I think it's quite like a traumatic book and quite a sad book, but something about it just felt like a hug to me. I think it was so imaginative. It was eerie, but kind of eerie I like. I also like that, for me anyway, the boy felt like a little bit of an unreliable narrator because you see him not quite remembering things, and so then you feel like Is he remembering it correctly? We're not sure if the events of this book actually take place. I also love that the hemstocks are magical, but we never quite label them. I think a lot of this book is really mysterious and it leaves things open to interpretation. I just fell in love with this book. So yeah, that's been my new way of rating books. I feel like it takes the pressure off a bit because it means, two books don't have to have the same quality of prose or the same quality of character for it to fall into the same rating. It just needs to give me the same feeling. And now when I do look back on the scores, I feel pretty satisfied with how I still rate my books. So yeah, thank you for sticking with me and I hope to see you back here for my next video.